All right, and we are supposedly live now.
Supposedly.
Supposedly. Wait for YouTube to catch up, but we are supposedly live. uh, how is everyone doing today?
I think I'm all right.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Wait, fantastic, wonderful. What did you say, Ocean?
I said I think I'm all right.
You think you're all right? That's
No,
I don't
you're all right.
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Check.
Yeah.
okay.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Yep.
So these clowns that you see here before me have troubled me for quite some time, just begging to come on my channel because I'm YouTube famous and they need the exposure. And
It's all
now,
true.
Absolutely.
no, the only part of that was true is that they're clowns. But
Valid.
what really happened was that a while back, Ocean and I got into what was supposed to be like a 10-minute conversation that ended up being 3 hours because we both have ADHD.
Happens.
And for some of that conversation, we ended up straying into talking about a pagan cult. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. I want to know more about that.
Along a winding road of talking about polytheism, I was like, I think that you were saying that one of the things that you thought was really neat about polytheists is that we tend to have like groups that aren't harmful. We tend to be focused on a lot of the same things that, as far as like, political concerns, that we tend to be aligned with y'all. By y'all, I mean atheists. And I think it's true. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that winds up being talked about a lot is religious harm, and that some people, the term antitheism gets thrown around. That means multiple things, but one of those meanings is that I like is against religious harm, and that polytheists aren't an exception to this entirely. Like there's definitely some forms of polytheism that wind up falling into some of these pitfalls of harmful practice. And I made a video some time ago about polytheism and superstition, where I went back to. Thank you. But I went to a Greek philosopher named Theophrastus discussing superstition, and how he saw superstition was practice that was harmful to yourself and others, which essentially is like identifying this element of religious harm that a lot of people take issue with. And I think that Theophrastus makes the comment as a polytheist about other polytheists, that people tend to do this, that be they Christian or be they whatever else. And heathenry in today's setting is of no exception to this. I think that Theodism is a good example of what we would call, in the Theophrastus sense, a superstitious cult.
All right.
I would agree.
And that is why we are getting into it today, because I'm interested in cults and I'm interested in talking about and exposing religious harm. Something very important to me. I don't generally take on the label anti-theist, because most of the time when people hear that term, they don't think I'm just talking.
They're talking about
religious harm.
Political opposition to the existence of religion, which is another usage of it.
That is not my position.
Right.
And that's the much more common usage of that word. So I would not take on that label, but I do tend to care more about religious harm.
I think that they're
about beliefs.
I think that atheists, people that use the term anti-theist tend to be more divided, but that's part of what makes it confusing. I think that it's largely 50-50. But there's no poll, you know what I mean? Like we can't. So, but I do think that a lot of people, like, part of the reason why the term is confusing is because you have one camp that means this and one camp that means this other more extreme and totally different thing, using the same term to define each other. But whatever the case on that,
I would rather just not use the label and just explain what I mean every time I'm introducing my ideas.
What I wind up using is anti-superstition, and then I'll explain what I mean by that. That it is a practice that is harmful to oneself or others. And that tends to cover the topic that anti-religious harm, anti-theists are talking about, in my opinion. So, in that sense, I'll be using the term superstitious to describe some of the practices that Theodists use. But I don't have so much personal experience with them, so I wanted to bring on people that do, and that's how I want to introduce Wolf the Red and Beofeld, which is the guy using these Anglo-Saxon magical runes over in the corner. So I guess, you had a list of questions that you sent over to us as well, that I really liked, and I wanted to, I thought there were definitely good springboards for a discussion, but I also wanted to bring in people that knew their stuff in regards to this topic.
Right. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Talk about what your background is and stuff.
Ocean, you want to start, buddy?
Everybody knows Ocean. Shut up, Ocean.
I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Ocean Keltoi. I'm a polytheist. I'm a heathen. I've got a YouTube channel where I talk smack. Make videos about polytheism, specific tradition, my specific tradition of heathenry, and I'll occasionally put criticisms up of elements of the atheist community or Christians as well, Christianity as well. That's me. I'm bad at ending things, this, Wolf.
Right. So I'm Wolf the Red. I've actually made several YouTube videos that I haven't uploaded to YouTube because I know, right?
Why not?
You should hear what Ocean has to say about that.
Upload them anyway.
Right. We could talk about this for quite a while.
Here's the basic thing that I said. I said this to Wolf about a couple weeks ago. I was like, if you don't upload your video, it's going to be a long time before you get around to making it perfect so you can upload it. And that was how long ago, Wolf?
2 weeks ago, probably 3 or 4 at least. I've had my first video done for over a month. I've made several since.
That as someone who hasn't uploaded a video in like a month, but upload.
Yeah, I know. We're all bad about it. But I'll get to it eventually. I was gonna try to get one out before I did this, so I could hey, go check out my channel. No,
yeah, that never.
When you have a channel, I will add it to the links in the description.
You got it. So I'm a Norse polytheist. I prefer to call myself a Norse heathen, which means pre-Christian, pan-Germanic faith of the folk. Historically, I'm a Reconstructionist. I try to recreate the religion as it was practiced 1,000+ years ago. I try to use historical sources and references to recreate in modern times what my ancestors used to do. I'm Wolf the Red on Twitter, all one word. I'm extremely ridiculous on Twitter, fairly snarky.
Truly.
Fairly snarky, he says.
Fairly snarky.
Fairly is definitely an understatement. Both of the links to Ocean's channel and Ocean's Twitter and Wolf the Red's Twitter are also in the description.
I'm heavily into tweeting about Norse stuff, but also if you're not into polytheism at all, I think I'm worth a follow. I
also post pictures of his adorable kids.
I post pictures of my adorable kids, and I go viral multiple times a week by accident by posting funny things. I don't know why I didn't join Twitter a long time ago. It's a lot of fun. I've only been on it for about 6 months, and I seem to be doing all right.
He's in the honeymoon period of Twitter. I've grown to hate it.
Yeah, right.
That happens.
But yeah, that's basically me. I live in the South. I know Ocean and Beofeld both personally. We actually lead a hearth group together. We at one point had 300 something members, and we've downsized to about 20 or 30 close personal friends who we've come to know and trust. Being a pagan in the South is pretty difficult, so it's great having these two guys at my back, and we've grown a lot together, and it's a lot of fun.
That sounds dope. I don't think I even have that many friends total.
It took us a while to get where we are. It was a lot of trial and error.
Yes. Yeah, there was, and we'll talk a little bit about a group that we were informally.
Yep.
And why we left, because it has something to do with the subject that we're talking
with
about.
what we're about to talk about.
Right. So, and I guess Beofeld, if you want to introduce yourself.
So I'm Beofeld, and I am a polytheist. I am an Anglo-Saxon pagan, which is not terribly different from the Norse heathen that Wolf is, or what Ocean is. They overlap considerably, but I follow the gods that would have been known in Northumbria in right about the same time as the conversion period, because I shout out to my my great source, the Venerable Bede. But I know these guys personally, and I'm also in the South, and I don't know what else to say.
That's enough, man.
He's extremely modest. He's probably one of the most intelligent people on the planet. Easily the smartest dude that I know personally.
There's also, before this, we've been harassing X-Cult Baby with myths and legends surrounding Beofeld.
Most of them are
mostly
true.
I almost didn't have these mooks on my channel because I was like, you know what? I've been harassed. I'm done with it.
X-Cult Baby
I'll give you
the stream.
I'll give you an example of the half truth that I gave and what's true about it and why it's like, because I said that Beofeld communicates mostly by Raven with parchments that are wax seals on them. The true element of that is that I have received several bits of correspondence from Beofeld in parchment with wax seals on them.
It's not the delivery service. It's kind of a big deal.
I mean, I could probably train one of the chickens to do it, but you know.
Yeah. I said that he was a wizard that lives on the edge of the woods and takes care of animals, and actually,
all of that's true.
Entirely true, 100%. He is a wizard that does live in the woods, and he has taken care of animals that show up to his house.
But by the time they said that, they'd said so many things that were complete bullshit. I was like, I don't know how much of that I can believe.
But are they complete bullshit?
Beofeld, tell X-Cult Baby about the Buzzard.
Oh, I told her about the Buzzard, but
okay. Tell the audience about the Buzzard.
There was a blizzard that blew in a buzzard, and it was chilling with my chickens, and so I took care of it through the blizzard until it was well enough to go off on its own. And that buzzard I named Buzzard, the Blizzard Buzzard.
Of course.
Because that's the only name available, really, when it comes right down to it. Anyway.
No other name really could be given to a Blizzard Buzzard. Blizzard. It's a Blizzard.
It's a Buzzard.
Oh. Okay, so now that we've fooled around for 10 minutes.
There you go.
Right. Let me actually jump into some of these questions that I have prepared. So first of all, I want you guys to talk about a little bit more about the versions of paganism that you practice. So we will have a bit of a frame of reference here when we're talking about Theodism. So we might let's just go in the order that you guys introduced yourselves for this.
I think that since we all practice together, there's subtle differences between us, but we're mostly the same. We're three Reconstructionist heathens that vary slightly in tradition between one another, and we share sources through one another, and we we'll have discussions with one another about the different elements that we've focused on, and Beofeld, for example, is somebody that I'll go to when I have a question about Anglo-Saxon history or history in general. Honestly, I'll want to get his perspective on it, and just call him up and kind of shoot back and forth with it. And yeah, so the three of us have managed to we do have a different practice between the three of us. I'm Wolf is Norse, Beofeld is Anglo-Saxon. I'm kind of hovering in between the two, but it's very easy for us to kind of
Join the
same-
dark side ocean.
He's gonna make you an Anglo-Saxon.
there's
yet.
a reputation among heathens that the Anglo-Saxons are like the real nerds, which isn't.
That's
it's
because we are.
It's true.
That does
It's
make
true.
sense based on what I know about you guys so far.
Yeah. Because like, anyway, but yeah, but I guess the difference between us and that you might find with some other groups, I don't know. And I think this is generally true with heathens, is that a lot of us are independent practitioners, and we and honestly our group is basically a series of independent practitioners that have joined groups and left groups. And Siri is freaking out right now.
Your practice is not at all dependent on a group.
No.
You could
Not-
exist without a group.
Most
but
people
you
practice
prefer
for years and years before they even find a group or are comfortable joining a group.
Yes.
it. Okay. So that's already a big difference from what most people recognize with various religions, because, you know, if you have people meeting together regularly, that's organized religion. But yours isn't organized religion. It's just
We meet
individual
regularly.
practitioners that
But-
meet regularly.
Yeah, but we were all already heathen when we met.
Right.
Like basically what our group is wound up being is like a continued fostering of what we've been for years. And I make the comment occasionally that heathens grow out of the ground, that we're that you don't go and convert a heathen, or so you just find them.
Yeah, heathens will convert on their own. They will get a feeling and they will start down a path, and then they will realize that they are heathen, and then they will try to find a group of like-minded individuals that
Which
they
is
can
an
practice
arduous
with.
task.
Yeah, it's nearly impossible. We're very lucky to know each other and then also get along. Like,
Right.
it's
This is true.
the three of us sitting here getting along and also being of similar mind on religion. That's unheard of. It just
Right.
doesn't happen.
Well, I'm glad that you guys were lucky enough to find each other then. And you know, the
I'll
funny
still
thing is now
fight
that-
Ocean. I'll fight Ocean right now.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
fair. I mean, I
Absolutely.
would too. We
We'll
all
come
love
to- we'll come to
Ocean. We would
fisticuffs.
definitely fight him. He's very fightable.
Wait for me to get the popcorn.
If
Fair
we
enough,
keep
fair
this stream going for an hour, I can be at his house in an
Yeah,
hour,
we can-
and I'll fight him on camera.
You'll hear him coming too. He's got a really loud motorcycle.
Yeah, you'll hear me pull up.
Of course, you have a motorcycle.
You'll hear him about 20 minutes before he gets here.
Oh, God.
It's very loud.
I do this
Through
with
my
very long
microphone.
jokes, but I.
I've got a beautiful Harley. It's very loud and very nice.
That's awesome. Oh gosh. So you all practice very similarly, but not quite the same.
Mhm.
You're all individual practitioners who meet together and happen to get along.
And we'll have group rituals as well with not only the three of us, but like
Yeah, the rest of
20
your
other people
different
as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. The funny thing is when you mentioned about you can't really like convert a heathen. You know, when you said that, I actually realized like all of the pagans that I have known just kind of convert, like they just kind of
converted
converted out of the
themselves.
blue
Yeah.
themselves. Like everyone that I've known, now that you've mentioned it, was either raised that way as far as just that's what their parents practiced and that was what they
Mhm.
were interested in, so they continued to do it,
Right.
or they found it themselves at some point in their life.
Right.
I've never heard of someone converting somebody else to pagan practice ever.
I don't think it happens.
We actually Ocean runs a very popular Polytheist Discord server, and we actively almost discourage people a little bit, not in a gatekeeping way, but in a you're about to have to do a whole lot of homework. There's a lot of reading involved. We want you
Right.
to do, in a way that you are educated and understand what it is that you're diving into.
And we'll,
Yeah,
Yeah, Ocean did tell me about that. I think that would make sense a lot as Reconstructionists. The history is extremely important. This isn't just something you kind of jump into.
nope.
right. And one of the things that we'll do if somebody comes in and says like I was an atheist and now I'm pagan or something like that, a lot of us will immediately go, okay, why?
Yeah, that's dubious
What?
as hell.
Right. Well, it's not necessarily dubious. A lot of us are ex-atheists. But what will happen is that we'll ask questions about why, and sometimes Most of the time, it's fine. You know what I mean? Like it's somebody that's having an honest journey. But there's been a couple of times where the experience has been somebody basically being manipulative or something like that. That's something that it's a very different response that pagans will have as a group than Christians will. If someone comes in and says, "Hey, I was an atheist and I'm a Christian,"
They're like,
yeah, it's like love bomb immediately, right? But with pagans, we're like, "Oh, we have questions. Come sit by the fire, but we have questions." And it's a very different dynamic because we're usually very interested in because a lot of us have had that experience of sort of converting ourselves. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to hear a little bit about that and talk about it and all that kind of stuff. So.
Sometimes there's UPG to share because maybe they have because they had to have come through something.
Right.
People that don't know, explain what that means.
Unverified personal gnosis is basically any time that you have a message from the gods that is meant for you personally. And so it could be the better term for it is really like an epiphany or a hierophany. Where you see the gods or have some sort of experience that lets you know that they're real.
Right.
And when we find someone that converts, they must have had something like that, because otherwise why would they think that our gods are real all of a sudden?
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that approach, because there are a lot of monotheistic religions that are like, yeah, this is based on my personal experience, but I expect you to hear my personal experience and be like, yeah, your God
and
is
immediately agree with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would that be a conversion tactic?
Not how that works.
No.
Personal experience is, by definition, a personal experience. This shouldn't be convincing to anybody but you.
Right.
So with that in mind, you can also talk about there's UPG, and then we talk about SPG, which is when two people have the same UPG and then it becomes shared personal gnosis, which still doesn't, if you want to analyze it, as for you philosophy nerds out there, if you analyze it from an epistemological perspective, this still doesn't mean knowledge or truth. It just means that we have shared experiences here and we can discuss them on terms of them being shared experiences. And then there's verified personal gnosis, which also still does not mean truth, but it means that it's verified by a historical document or a tradition of experience, or so it's like some kind of lineage. Or there's a point where SPG becomes so common that it is considered VPG just because of how expansive it is. But even then, it's you're still looking at an analysis of personal experience. You're not looking at an absolute fact or something like that, or it's not a way to that, if that makes sense. But it is a belief that can be discussed in that sense. It's like this is how I would just describe my engagement with so on and such as. So, anywho, with all that in mind, Theodism.
Funny how we keep getting totally off track.
I know
It's have ADHD, huh? That's
gonna happen.
Yeah.
This is how heathens communicate. We have to lay groundwork. We have to have foundations, or else you won't understand a damn thing we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think we do need that.
Wolf the Red, explanations that begin at the dawn of time.
Oh my gosh. Hail Paul Harrell.
Okay. I'm just
Let me give you an anecdote.
The inside joke.
It would take too long to explain.
It'll take too long, yeah. Required explanation that begins at the dawn of time.
Don't do that. Okay, so my next question that I have written is, what was your introduction to and experience with Theodism?
That's
so not necessarily everything you know about it, but just kind of how you came to know about it.
I think that the most interesting person to answer that is going to be Beofeld.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess that's my my cue. When I've been pagan for a long time. I have been pagan for a really long time, in fact. But I wasn't public with my paganism, and I hadn't reached out to anyone until about 2015, because at that point I wanted to find some sort of community. And the variety of paganism that I was most interested in was the Anglo-Saxon version of heathenry. and so I was going and looking for an Anglo-Saxon group, and there was this one group that was GFS or something like that, and I tried to join them, but the problem was that they were mostly defunct, and one of the members steered me towards someone who was local-ish. And I reached out to them, but they said that they weren't in that group, that they were in the Theodism, which I had not been in pagan circles talking to people. I had been in the sources. I'd been in the books. And so I didn't know what Theodism was. And so I asked questions, and I tried to do some research on my own. The deeper that I dug, the more things that I was finding out. I asked about, you've got a lord, how does that work? You've got to do thraldom, how does that work? It seems sort of, it galls me, in my throat. You know what thraldom is?
I do not.
So a thrall, the definition, it's an Anglo-Saxon word, Old English word, that essentially means slave. And so there's a particular thing with Theodism, which is a period of ritual slavery, in a way. It's a period that they call worthing. So you're worthless until you can build your worth within the group.
Oh man, I do not like that.
And so you go through the period of thraldom before they accept you in the community. So you have to build your worth to the point in which you can buy yourself back again. And so you...
So it becomes a form of indentured servitude, debt slavery kind of approach.
Yeah.
Until you can learn their ways and their process and how they do things and what they do and how they ritualize and things like that. There's possibly manual labor stuff involved for around the ritual area, and things like that. But in any case, I probed deeper, and the deeper that I probed, the less I liked it. And then I found other people that said, there's Anglo-Saxons that aren't that, and then I hung out with them instead. And I found a local group, these guys among them. I followed another guy that was trying to get into the same Anglo-Saxon group that I was, into a local group that we're going to talk about later, I'm sure. But he was an Anglo-Saxon pagan. He's not anymore. He's a Norse pagan now. He switched over to the light side. But I had followed him in to the local group, which was a much better thing at that time.
Well,
That wound up
out of that. Jeez.
at the group that he joined afterwards was a group that that Wolf and I were a part of as well.
Yep.
And that wound up going sour for other might say cult related reasons. But anywho, that I would say that that gives you kind of an introduction into Theodism and kind of what it is. That it is a version of heathenry. It is polytheistic. But they where they diverge from a lot of heathens is practice. Mm-hmm. That they have a lot of ways of community management that start to that don't make sense if you and
that doesn't sound like very individualistic practice anymore.
It's because it's not. The Theodism, the word itself is it means tribalism essentially, because Theod is the people, the tribe, and that's what the Theodism is. And they have a king, they have lords, and then they have vassals under the lords, and then they have thralls or slaves at the bottom. And so it's a pyramid structure.
Straight up feudalism, basically.
Yeah.
But within a religious context.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
That is wild.
So, Beofel, talk a little bit about the king, the first king.
Oh, that was
and
Garman Lord.
How he came to be. They said there was a vision, right?
Yeah. Essentially, Garman Lord was originally he was apparently in a Wicca context, which is an initiatory tradition. You sort of move up and get initiation in Wicca. So he had a background in an initiatory tradition, but he apparently had a vision, and the vision told him that he was going to create a tribe, become a king, and he essentially went out and did just that. He became a king. He became Garman Lord, Lord of the Theods.
And I have said, I was saying, talking to Beofeld about this earlier, is that Theodism kind of comes off to me as like the heathen Mormonism. That you have
It's almost identical.
You have some of these kind of like, group control practices as well as like personal vision kind of things of grandeur with the founder. That winds up looking a little iffy. Upon further examination, that there's a lot of...
We have a very important question in the chat.
Is being a beard mandatory for being a polytheist? No, but it seems to happen.
All right. Answer. Sorry. Just
but yeah, that's what I've noticed. What's kind of my issue with it is this idea of worthing. That it does seem to be like an introductory to the kind of community control that you wind up seeing happening, kind of being exacted later. Which, when you go through the bite model element of the conversation, that's gonna... Beofeld's got answers to a lot of that stuff. So yeah.
I'm ready to tear into the bite model on this.
Let's bite into it.
So the next question that I have is more of the specifics on what differentiate Theodism from other pagan practices, specifically heathenry, because that's obviously what you guys are the most familiar with.
Right. We've talked a little bit about that.
Yeah. So obviously the worthing, that's kind of a big fucking deal. This whole idea of basically being a slave, the class system involved, that's a lot.
I think that when religious groups start to form, and I think this is true of Christians as well, you do get a sense of hierarchy that winds up. But I think that's what you get that with groups of humans in general. You wind up with hierarchies. Yeah. I see that with atheists as well. If you look at atheist organizations, hierarchy starts forming. You wind up getting hero worship and that kind of shit that just starts to happen.
I've heard so many people refer to Christopher Hitchens as the late, great Christopher Hitchens. And every time I hear that, I'm like, the late, great... Just
there's hero saga worship of Christopher Hitchens. That's definitely true, and I think that there's you're seeing kind of legendary hero elements around certain atheist personalities. It's normal. It's not necessarily really but it's a thing that people should be mindful of, and I think that within any religious group, you wind up having people that are like people that others look up to, that others want to get knowledge from, and that kind of thing. And I think that it depends on how the people that wind up within that hierarchy somewhere respond to certain things. Like, are they people look up to you? Great. Are you taking that opportunity to share knowledge, or are you taking that opportunity to develop a system in which you get to share knowledge if there's exchange or something like that? Does somebody have to do something for you in order to get taught or something like that? It winds up because if there's free sharing, and one of the things that I try to do is when people ask me questions about stuff, I'll try to show them where they can find that information, as well as telling them a little bit about because I do book recommendations regularly.
Master or their teacher
right.
Or anything.
Exactly. I'm happy to teach people. I don't want to be seen as somebody where in order to get the knowledge, you must come through me, kind of thing. And that's where that's
Because
what I'm
that
seeing
is-
happen
that
with
is
Theodism.
A big cult leader thing is you
Right.
can only get this through me. I'm
Well-
the only source.
It's also something that doesn't make sense in heathenry, because our religion is ancient old, and it ceased to exist, and we're trying to put the pieces back together. And what we're creating will never be exactly what it was, because that's impossible.
Right.
But
Right.
the problem is that everything we have is in readily available books and texts.
Mhm.
Every single bit of the lore is easily accessible online. All of the sources are online. They're in every library at every university, and they're so accessible. Anyone can have them at any time.
And so
The problem
very-
is
Go ahead.
is in interpretation, and so then you have to be able to process the history that you're looking at. You know,
And so it then becomes very, it's very strange, and it's a big red flag for us, for someone to step in and say, you must do these things for me, and you must kneel at my feet to be able to understand what it is that I understand. I understand this, but I'm not going to tell you how I understand it until you jump through these hoops for me. Then
Right.
it becomes an issue.
Right.
Because then it's very much about that person and not just about this sort of exchange of knowledge and tradition. Because if your goal is to rebuild something that was lost, you shouldn't be making people jump through hoops to get it.
Mm-hmm. Can I talk a little bit about how that works? So with one of the questions that I get really commonly is, how do I find sources? What books would you recommend, and that kind of thing. Those are the really, really like, how do I start out? These kind of things. And one of the, when I was kind of getting into paganism, I was getting into it through studying Irish Celtic Christianity and getting into some of the inspirations for that and I found the process of finding sources while I was getting a history degree was arduous and challenging. It is not easy to find out even how to find the sources that you're looking for. Like, the process of trying to look for them is hard to get a grasp of. So once I finally started getting the hang of it, people that are new and trying to get into it, I'll often just send them into the direction of texts. But that process of trying to figure it out, like historiography and all this other crap, that Beofeld can attest to being difficult to get your mind around sometimes. It's not easy to teach so directly, but the challenge of being able to find those sources is readily apparent to anybody who's getting into paganism. So somebody who is looking for sources and looking for knowledge, and then they bump into this group with this guy who's like, yeah, sure, I'll tell you these elements and all this stuff, and kind of get you into the history of it if you clean my house. That's, for some people, it's like, well, sure, I'll do that. It becomes, and it starts out small, and then you get into the O thing, and then you get into were thing, and then you get into this, it's, and then you're
before
sucked
you know it,
into
you're
this,
stuck.
right? And that they're controlling who your friends are. They're controlling,
Ooh, that's familiar.
and yeah, and there's also a shunning element if you leave and that kind of stuff. So that's a whole nother thing as well. So anywho, I know that those are come up in future questions, but I want to just kind of point out that
it's fine. This is
part of
all
the
very
temptation of it is how
overlapping stuff.
yeah, but part of the temptation of it is how hard it is to find this stuff. And even though it is out there and readily available, a group that treats it like secret knowledge can come off as being legitimate secret knowledge to somebody who can't find that information or is having trouble finding that information.
As most of us here, and we've talked about earlier, most of us deconverted from Christianity in some form, especially in the South. It's super common. And moving from Christianity into heathenry in any form, it becomes super intimidating to go from here is the one book that has everything you need to know, and there's a church every block. Usually they're built across the street from each other. You can wander into any of them, and they're glad to have you, and they'll ask for some of your money, but otherwise, free knowledge every weekend. Whereas in heathenry, it's you may be talking to a pagan, and they may even lie to you and tell you they're not a pagan because they're afraid you're a Christian, and they don't want to be outed as a pagan. You can have two pagans who will both lie to each other and say they're both not pagan to avoid the stigma of paganism.
There was a guy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about, right? Who I'm thinking about. Yeah.
I know, that's why I brought it up.
There's a when I was in college and I was getting into paganism, right? There was a pet shop that I would go to, and I'd hang out there like nearly every day, and I got to know the owner really well. And because we were just there was I was fascinated with reptiles, and there was a bunch of reptiles there, and I was kind of there part-time and that kind of stuff, getting into animals. And the owner of the shop, who was so kind to me and personal with me, was also pagan. And I was pagan at the time. Neither one of us were aware that the other one was pagan until I bumped into him at a group meeting with a different group 6 years later, after I'd graduated.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "No, what are you doing here?"
That's incredible.
And so that situation happens way more often than it should. And so when you have these heathens who are terrified to even let people know that they are heathen due to religious persecution from other Christians, their family members, their places of work, their friends they've had for years. I'm sure as most atheists have dealt with flack from their families, not to play the who's got it worse game, but it seems to usually be a little bit worse when you tell Christians that you're now worshiping demons instead of just not worshiping anything at all.
I've met Christians that act like, I'd rather you worship false gods than no god at all. That's crazy. But I've also met ones that are like, it's the demon.
I've definitely seen both, and it definitely does swing both ways.
Yeah.
History goes back and forth.
Right. And so to get to the end of my point was that when you're in that situation, when you have someone who says, "Hey, I've got all the knowledge," you tend to gravitate towards that just because finally somebody who can help explain this to me. Because if you're just Googling paganism, you're going to get Wikipedia articles and stuff like that. Yeah. It is readily available and it is out there, but good luck finding one that's accurate, historically accurate, full of sources that you can verify, not some fluffy bunny woo bullshit, not crystals, not magic, just crazy stuff that we three sitting here shake our heads at constantly. If you just try to Google heathen information,
you're not
you don't get that.
And sometimes you run into and heathenry specifically can be a minefield, because you have Theodism, you have folkism. It's just you have like people that are using these symbols and lore and stuff for like neo-Nazi sort of groups and that kind of shit. So it's a minefield for somebody who's new. And a lot of times they'll get caught up in some of this stuff and be like, well, because that's what it is, right?
I can't imagine people of color. I can imagine people of color would have a hard time getting into heathenry because those sources, those very obviously racist sources, are
a thing. They exist.
So readily available. It's like, oh, this is not something I want to get involved in,
And that experience you're talking about is definitely a thing. Yeah.
And I can say personally, like when I see someone that I'm fairly certain is a heathen, I gotta look twice and see, does this person, do I think that they're going to be a Nazi? It is a minefield, because not only are we a lot of times trying to hide our paganism from, say, the Christian world because of the repercussions that could come from that, but we don't want to associate with Nazis or racists or anything like that. And so even when we do find someone in the outside world that we don't know, they could be a racist. And that's it's a legitimate problem.
Yeah.
There are several pagan discords out there that we associate with, and a few of them have like front gates that you can kind of hang out in before you get access to the rest of the server, or before you can send messages to the rest of the server.
And that's part of the reason.
You'll have them ask you questions that would be considered dog whistles for racism. They'd be like, "Hey, how do you feel about people of color? Or how do you feel about people of color practicing traditions that you practice?" And just trying to bait you into saying anything that would be remotely racist, so that they can then ban you from the server and you can't come back.
Right. As soon as somebody starts trying to talk about a genetic link between religion and it just gets to be like, oh, okay, well.
And so you see Ocean wearing one, and mine's hidden under my superior beard. We've got these things. We refer to them as hammers, or they're Mjolnir, which is Thor's hammer. It's usually the tell that
Marvel movies I know.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. There's no difference at all.
Yeah,
They're actually historical documents.
If you guys
we
have
refer to
been
them
with
often.
me all this time, I'm definitely going to talk about your gods, like Thor from the Marvel movies. Okay?
That's actually like a fairly common, almost annoying exchange. It's one but you'll get people that are doing it in good humor, and then you'll also get people that are going, "Har har, you worship Marvel superheroes," and that's like that's when it gets here. Yeah,
funny.
Exactly. But go ahead.
So, Blue Collar Heathen, who is, I'm sure you guys would all agree, is incorrectly named, but
We've talked with him about that, but we like that guy. Yeah,
he gets a pass. He's the one.
As paganism seems rather pluralistic, do the guys as Reconstructionists see much consensus on interpretation of the lore, or is that left open to individual interpretation?
Oddly enough, it's a combination.
Yeah,
Beofeld might jump into that.
It's absolutely. I'm just going to step in because Beofeld. Well, I defer to Beofeld often, even though he's Anglo-Saxon and I'm Norse. I often love to hear what he has to say. He studied this.
It's a demonstration of the answer to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. He studied this longer than I've been heathen for maybe about 10 years, a little bit less, right at about 10 years. He's done this significantly longer, and he spent more time researching than I have. I like to be in the public and speak about things, whereas he's behind the scenes doing a lot of the hard work in research and writing papers and writing stuff like that. So when it comes to the individual part, we all have our own ideas.
Approach.
Yeah, we all have our own ideas and approach. I practice at home a little bit differently than Ocean does or Baleful does, but at the same time, we all generally agree on pretty much everything asterisk. And so Beofold can dive into it a little bit further if he wants to.
So it's a bit of a tough question in regards to the fact that there are incorrect answers because there are incorrect understandings of the historical significance of the sources. And so since this is historical and we're attempting to look at a reconstruction as best we possibly can, then we're trying to. So let me go about this a different way. The reason why we're doing reconstruction the way that we are is because the assumption is that if we're trying to contact these old gods, then the last people that had a relationship with these old gods were these ancient pagans. And so if they were doing it and had a relationship with them, then we can mimic that and have a relationship with those gods as well. And so the better job that we do in mimicking the interpretations that they might have had, then it's possible that we could try and recreate the relationship. Now, we don't have to recreate everything, because not everything. Yeah, exactly.
Right. You can drive a car, Yeah.
There's no reason to recreate everything, just the aspects that would be religious, because there's plenty of stuff in the society that has no bearing on religion whatsoever. But the religion aspect of it, the process, the practice of it. That's what we're trying to mimic as much as we can. And we can inform ourselves from other pagan groups because, to be honest, there's a lot of other ones that have better sources. The Romans gave us lots of great sources, but the heathens not so much. And so we can build a better understanding of things through understanding other pagan things. But you can see how it becomes very historical.
Yeah.
The problem is that history is old, it's long, and you have various periods of history where the interpretations get a little bit sketchy. For instance, anything in the 1930s and 1940s dealing with Germanic anything is going to be flavored by Nazism. The Nazis got their fingers in a lot of pies, and they interpreted history in a completely different way, which was geared towards maximizing the Nazi propaganda machine. And so anything from that era, you basically have to steer clear from because it's flavored by Nazism. And so there are incorrect interpretations. And so a lot of it is attempting to try and look for a historical interpretation, but it only goes so far. There becomes points where you run out of history. And when you run out of history, you're not trying to reconstruct something and then stop with some ruins. You want to build a whole thing. And so you have to fill in the gaps. And it's at that point that it's however you want to reconstruct it that fits within the worldview that we're talking about, the worldview of those ancient heathens. If it's something that they would have thought, then your interpretation is as good as mine, so long as it's fitting within the scope of that.
All right, that's a very thorough answer. I don't mean that as an insult. It's not supposed to be like, yeah, that was real thorough. Thanks for talking so much. I just mean
Beowulf, you're a fucking. Anyway,
I'm a pedant. No. I'm sorry.
Oh no, but really, that was a great answer. I think that I can't imagine fully covering the topic more. Like it's
that standard everything. Actually gets into a little bit of what some of the issues that pop up when talking about Theodism is because I
was just about to go in that direction. So
right, so how does that affect Theodism? So there are certain practices that are not found in history that wind up being very important authoritative things within Theodism, such as, and I think Wolf can expand on this, the idea that iron is profane and knots being profane. And Wolf had a conversation with someone recently that kind of dove into that.
Yeah, so the way that they practice their rituals or ceremonies, we say ritual, and I know some people may cringe at that, but it's, it's a ceremony. It's a religious ceremony.
It is.
They don't allow, they don't allow any kind of iron into the religious space. They don't allow knots, like literal just shoelaces tied together, or if my beard had a knot in it, I would have to work the knot out before I was allowed to step foot in.
Now that just sounds like there's a whole room for racists, because I cannot guarantee there's no knots in my hair right now.
That kind of came to my head as soon as
we kind of had that conversation earlier.
Yeah, because it was like, wait, so is that like a de facto folkism?
Yeah, if you have kinky curly hair,
right, exactly.
I mean, look
I didn't even think about that.
I've got a mane of hair.
I didn't realize that until just now. Like, wow.
It's also just strange that they would take that so far as to apply it to hair, because that is.
And see, I specifically asked that. Like, I was almost trying to be a little sarcastic. I was like, well, "What about beards?" And he goes, "You have to take it out." I was like, "Are you kidding me?"
Wow.
Like, I was just trying to be a little sarcastic, and him go, "Oh no, we wouldn't go that far." He goes, "No, we go that far." Certain type of clothing is not supposed to be worn. Modern clothing isn't supposed to be worn. If you don't have what's called like turn shoes, which are basically just slippers, leather slippers, you have to go barefoot. You have to take your shoes off because you can't have shoelaces, stuff like that. And it's interesting because of the nefarious. They cite iron being a ferrous metal. and so no weapons would be allowed because most weapons are made out of iron or have iron in them. Both, guns or knives or swords or anything like that would be historical. I myself sometimes carry a sword. This armor, I know some people are probably like rolling their eyes that I'm wearing it, but this is actually my religious garb. I've got an entire suit, and it helps me feel closer to the gods. I wouldn't be allowed to wear it in their space because there are metal pieces on this armor keeping it together. And he said, specifically your armor, we wouldn't allow it, even if. And I was like, well, it's actually held together by brass. And he said, still, we wouldn't allow it. So even though it passed the rule, still wouldn't allow it. Part of that control, they want to have that control.
Yeah, that
and
sounds
so we were,
very much to me like some rules the Jehovah's Witnesses had, like, oh, you can't eat blood that's in the Bible, but you can't do blood transfusions either because it's kind of sort of the same.
Right. And so we were discussing the iron thing, myself and this individual who I want to not name. They were telling me that they do have
one piece of iron.
Yeah, they do have one piece of iron that loophole is allowed, called a sacrificial CX. And it's just basically a knife, a long knife, probably about that long. Blade's probably about that long. And it is used to sacrifice an animal. For our, here in this chat's bloats, we tend to not sacrifice animals. We make other sacrifices of like
tent,
food.
like we've ever.
Yeah. Or a virgin or something.
Yeah,
no,
right.
I'm kidding. We sacrifice things like food or things that we make. We may carve something out of wood.
Right.
Things like that, art, whatever.
Bread.
But they
Bread
specifically kill animals every time. They
every
time? Say again?
I'm just surprised. I didn't know this. Okay.
Every bloat,
ceremony?
it is required that they sacrifice an animal, specifically pigs in this instance. But
to clarify, they kill the animals on the spot. It's not like
yes,
they
it
go
is
to a
alive.
butcher's
It is a live
market.
animal. It is a live animal, and they kill it on the spot. They sacrifice on the spot.
That's something that's very controversial among modern pagans. There's some some see it as I'm of two minds about it. Like, I see in one sense that you can look at it in the same way as one would look at kosher foods, for example. That's essentially a sacrifice of an animal. And halal meat as well is basically it's ritual killing of an animal, and for consumption. And I think that in this case, it's a ritual killing of a pig for consumption. If I'm assuming the for consumption part, is that a thing? Wolf, do you know?
Say that again. The last part.
Is the for consumption? Is there?
Yes, they
would
afterwards.
Yes,
they would spill blood, and then they would use the entire animal. That's something I wanted to say.
Right.
Is they would cook. I know part of these specific practices. They do use the entire animal. Nothing is wasted. All the way down to the bones get used.
Whoa. Intestines?
Chitlins.
Yeah, chitlins. That's you're in the South, baby. I mean, come on.
I forgot that we're talking about Southern pagans.
Yeah,
here,
right.
Okay? I live in Ohio.
We're a whole special breed.
All right. I live in Ohio. We don't do chitlins, okay?
Well, we don't all do chitlins,
Fair enough.
But yeah, so like there's an argument for it, right? But at the same time, a lot of pagans are like, and I think most people, especially in modern society, are like, I'll eat meat, but I don't necessarily need to be present for the sacrificial killing. It's like
I can't really 100% because I realize I am not an idiot, and I know that anytime I eat meat, it involves something being killed.
Right.
And since I wasn't even
anytime you eat
for the
food,
killing, I can't even guarantee that it was done ethically. I don't know that.
Right.
So I guess that in that sense, I can't have an issue with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess
I've run away with the same
as far as being of two minds about it.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at with that. But I think that it's definitely controversial among pagans. Our group, like in our practices, that's not a thing for us. But it's something that's like, it's discussed and it's okay, fine, I can understand it. It's just, I think that it's one of the standards that I would put forward, that is, if you're going to do it, you should be doing it with safety precautions and humane approaches and that kind of thing. And it's hard for me to imagine humane approaches and it's a live animal being brought into a circle and there's a knife available. Like it seems like there's a lot that can go wrong there. So anywho, that's
so to circle
there's
all the
that
way
subject.
back, we dove into that part of it. but
Well,
to circle
for
all
us
the way back-
specifically, we have votive offerings, and so it doesn't necessarily for us have to be an animal. We could make an animal out of wood, or make an animal out of bread, or make an animal out of clay.
I've baked animal cookies and I've baked animal bread. I've carved a animal out of a potato. It looked like an animal. It looked like a little cow. And
that's so cute.
Right,
Did you
and you
take
throw it into the
pictures?
fire, and so it represents the animal that I would want to sacrifice. I also I've got really cool goats that are made out of straw. They're Yule goats, and
you'll set up a bunch of them and set them on fire. In Sweden,
it sounds silly, but I have the goat in my home for a year. I keep it for 365 days, and then a full year later, I sacrifice that goat, and then I get a new one. It's a straw goat. I just put it into the fire. It bursts into flames. That is my goat offering for the year.
I don't think that's silly. I mean, I would definitely rather you do that than throw an actual live goat into a fire.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a long-standing practice of this. I believe in Sweden. It's like the goat of Gotland, I believe. Anyway, there's a huge straw goat that is pulled out every.
It's about 20 feet tall.
I know. About
and there's
that.
like almost a game going on with the local populace to see who can set it on fire before it's supposed to be. And there's actually, you can find a list on Wikipedia of the years of like how many years it survived and how many years it hasn't, and including one year where a flaming arrow came out of a crowd. And that was a guy with a bow dressed up as Santa Claus, and another guy that was accompanying him that was dressed up as a gingerbread man were seen fleeing the scene.
That is incredible. That's incredible. Oh my god. Oh,
and so my practice.
So there's historical practice.
My goats are only about a foot tall, and I care for them, and he's just right in the other room. He's a little Christmas goat.
Of your little straw goats.
Yeah, for sure.
That's really cute.
But the ancient pagans used to do votive offerings as well, and so it's not like it's anything that's particularly new. That is a historical practice.
You would see it in funerary practices as well.
Yeah.
You see carvings of people's possessions that would be put into a funeral pyre. That would be metal or wooden. Sometimes wooden carvings of things were buried with people. That's how we know they exist. Since we'd find them in burial mounds, where sometimes people would be buried with entire ships. So, or sometimes people would be put into a hold, which is just like a kind of a burial area that's made out of rocks stacked on top of each other, essentially, where the cremated body would be surrounded by votive elements. They were like just life tools.
The best example that I know of is actually the terracotta warriors in China, because that entire army is a votive thing. They're to represent individuals in the army, and they were put into the grave of the emperor.
That is
Drew just said in the chat.
To circle this all the way back to our conversation a second ago, the reason I brought up the iron and the sacrificing and all that is they ban various metals except for the sacrificial dagger that is made out of various metals. And so
the most important thing that's there is made out of the profane metal.
What was told to me, like word for word from this person, told to me the reason they sacrifice is to pay for I can't remember I don't want to use the word sin because I don't think that's the word that he used, but the wrongness of using the iron weapon.
But you're using it to do the sacrifice. That doesn't make any sense.
I'm actually going to look up to see if he used the word sin.
That
doesn't work.
Yeah, that doesn't
also
work.
with knots, and Beofeld brought this up, and I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there, that most clothes are made out of knots.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go ahead and just read this. part
Everything's
right here.
woven together. The thread that goes on the end of your hymns has knotted together many times to keep the hymn in place. Not only that, but since y'all brought up hair,
Heathens were described as having matted hair by the English.
well, that's not the area of hair that I was thinking about.
Oh, of course.
Well, yeah.
Y'all talking about combing your pubes? That's
Hey, I
gay.
mean, you gotta. You're
gonna
worried about
mention it that
knots.
explicitly.
I mean, if
That's-
But okay, here's the question though.
you might say it's not a concern.
If you're a Theod and you're going to, what did you call it? Sorry, I already forgot.
Bloat.
Bloat. If you're going to bloat and you have nasty, ratty pubes, who's gonna check? Who's gonna check and make sure all of it's combed out? Nobody.
That's a good
So you
point.
don't have to worry about it.
At that point, you would be.
Yeah, it seems to be a weird rule. So
you would
the
be-
whole
you would be
no knots
blasphemous to the
thing
gods.
has a lot of like issues.
Yeah.
You know,
Historically.
whether that be clothing or whether that be your own personal hair. You know, I don't understand. I didn't even know about the no knots thing. You know, that was new to me,
Yep.
and that's weird.
And so they say the act of bloat includes, as part of it, an act of expiation against the sin of
Oh,
introducing.
he said sin.
So it does say
He did
sin.
say sin. Does say sin.
That's kinda-
That's latent
Okay.
Christianity.
Excellent Baby's referencing my video, guys.
Yeah, they are.
I am, and but the thing is that you have so many great ideas on these kinds of subjects, and it's like,
That's a
Blue
good
Collar
term.
Heathen wants to know what is it about the knots that would be profane.
No
We don't
idea.
know.
It doesn't make any logical sense
Oh, okay.
whatsoever. There's no historical text or documents that support it, and there are many like
Historical observations that would in fact counteract it.
parallel other heathen. My words fail me. I'm so sorry.
Sources?
Practices that encourage knots, like Celtic polytheism.
Right.
The Celtic
knots.
knot.
It's
Duh.
super
Knots are
popular.
They're
Knots
literally
are
sacred.
Very, very much a part of their practices, their
So-
artwork, their ethnicity, and
This is
so
Together, the
for
way
there
that
to
they
be
put
a
it.
brand of heathenry that is anti-knots is just really weird to me.
Yeah.
It's knots. It's knots.
not.
God damn it. Okay. I'm going back to my questions. I'm tired of y'all.
Are there sources? I'm afraid not.
I was literally about to make that pun, but you beat me to it, and you did it well. I commend you.
All of you heathen clowns. I'm tired. Okay. No, but seriously, I think that's kind of interesting because it very much plays into what you were saying earlier about how, like, yes, there is individualistic interpretation, but you can be wrong.
Right.
And that whole thing with the knots is just like, there's no source for this. This comes
Yeah.
from nowhere.
The knots,
They pulled
it's
this out of
hard
their
to
ass.
metal and all that. The contradiction, the logical inconsistency. The fact that we can sit here and have a 5-minute conversation and go, this doesn't make sense because
I was trying
all-
to steel man it. I couldn't. Like,
yeah,
I,
we tried to steel man the
You wouldn't
iron.
be
And we
able
couldn't.
to because the steel would be kicked out.
yeah, it's a ferrous metal anyway, so we can't steel man anything.
Right.
But it's like the idea of like, to expand on the Celtic knot thing. There are, we find Celtic knots, and we see them described as Celtic knots within Irish and Scottish culture specifically. It expands southward as well. But when you go into, and spirals as well are sacred. And when you go just across the sea to what would be Norse culture into Scandinavia, into Scandinavia,
Yeah, I knew.
you find also knotting that are they're not as curvy, they're more straight lines, lots of cornering. The Volk knot, for example, is a knot that is sacred, and or at least it seems to be sacred. The placement that we find the Volk knot, or what we call the Volk knot in several paintings. The Volk knot, for anybody that's curious, it's a series of 3 triangles that are all interlaced, which is a knot. So the idea that knots would be sacred with any religion with that symbol as a centerpiece makes no sense.
Yeah, that doesn't. It not only doesn't follow, but it is in fact contradictory to a lot of.
We're spending a lot of time on ranting about nuts, but the reason why it winds up being important.
Oh,
I do not understand this conversation, but the problem that results from that is that you see that the combing and grooming, the concern about knots and all this other kind of thing winds up being a behavioral control, which feeds into the bite model.
Behavioral
because it doesn't make sense historically. The only reasonable conclusion that you could make for why would be this other reason, which is behavior control. Does that make sense?
You have to look a certain way. You have to act a certain way, or else you can't hang with us.
Yeah.
Right.
You're out. And then when you're out, you're cut off from your information.
Because that's in the bite model, right?
Bite model stuff.
Yeah, let's go through it.
Get into it. All right. And any of you can hop in with examples or just kind of saying, I don't know if that applies, but I'm just going to run through it real quick.
Go for it.
So for those of you that may not know, the bite model was created by Stephen Hassan, and he is an expert on cults. He was in one, which is when he started getting into it and being fascinated by it, did all this research. And he created this model that shows sort of some of the hallmark features of a cult. And it can apply not only to religious cults, but other kinds of cults, even just like a single person who just has a cult of personality, who's just like a really, So it can apply to a lot of things. So we're going to apply this model to Theodism. Sorry, go ahead.
One big clarification I want to make. Am I right that you don't need to have every single one in order to be considered a cult? Right.
You don't have to have every single one. It's more that if you even have 2 or 3 in each category, that's still kind of like
that's pretty bad. Red flag.
Right. Yeah.
I'm reading through this just really quickly because you kind of sent it to us ahead of time. And it's nailing everyone in my opinion.
Well,
it has the
Yeah. Okay. So BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. And since we've already gotten into, behavior control, let's start there. So the first thing under behavior control is that the group or the leader promotes dependence and obedience. And obviously with the whole fucking slavery thing, that's
thraldom,
that
yes.
couldn't be more freaking obvious.
So I wanna just really quickly. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but there's something in heathenry called and just in general oathdom or oathing, taking an oath. For heathens, that's the highest level of I'm swearing my entire honor, all of my worth, my entire reputation on whatever this oath is centered around. You sometimes hear some heathens talk about making an oath to a god. Generally, us here, we don't really do that. We don't do that here.
It's kind of like
we don't get into
an interpretation between the three of us, and I'll talk a little bit about why as well. For me personally, but I know Balefeld, Wolf, and myself do not see oathing as anything that is necessary for being a heathen. Some people do see it as necessary. It's like you absolutely must oath to a deity or person or something like that, and that's I see that as absurd. One of the reasons why is there is a heathen saga called the Jomsvikings. For me, that's my reasoning. That the Jomsvikings in the story, they are a group of badass warriors that lived in a fortress called Jomberg, and they had very almost arbitrary but very specific rules about who could be there and why and all that, the kind of earning that you needed to do. And I think some of Theodism might come from trying to imitate Jomsburg. But in the story, there is a night where all of them get wildly drunk, and they all make these grandiose oaths to each other. And one of them says, I oath to that. The fortress was on the northern shore of Germany. And one of them goes, I oath to invade Sweden and take it over. And another one says, if you do it, I oath to go with you. And then another one does the same thing. And it's, if you're going to do it, then I oath to go with you. And all this other, and they're drunk as hell.
Yeah.
They all wake up the following morning and they're like, what did we fucking do? And they go, well, oath to invade Sweden. So they do it. They all get on their boats and they wind up going in, and there's this giant story about how much of a failure that was. And to me, the thing that I pull from that is that if you're going to make oaths, be very careful about what they are. Don't make them lightly, and don't be stupid with them. And honestly, another interpretation that I walk away with is that they're pretty much unnecessary. That they don't, because there's nothing. These people are in the story are seen as spectacular heroes, and even the invasion that goes absolutely horribly has some really awesome elements of it that make these heroes that participate in it legendary. But the actual oathing part is the mistake that they make. So the lesson learned from that is that this is a terrible fucking plan.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but in Theodism, it's one of those things where it's required in order to make this thing, make this action that is
even
seen
get
in
in
Beyond
the
Psychings as a
door.
mistake.
You're not even allowed to show up and hang out unless you agree to oath to a person, which means you have to swear everything of yourself, your entire identity, then is sworn to this person, and you have to kneel at your, and they call themselves lords, capital L. Every time
the capitalization is interesting that they do.
it's capital L. Your lord is your master in this situation, and he's your direct contact. He's your direct knowledge bearer. When your lord calls you, you have to answer, even if it's at 3 a.m. If he needs you, you have to get up and you drive and you do whatever your lord asks you to. If you don't, you're out.
I do not like that. Nervardia asked a good question. Do oaths sworn when a kid hold firm? Specifically in reference to, Jehovah's Witnesses get baptized as young as like pre-adolescent sometimes. I've heard of as young as 7.
I've seen it
never
happen.
heard any younger than that.
Yeah, I've seen baptism
it
happen in like Baptist Christianity. It happens super young. As soon as the kid's willing to say, "I want to be baptized," they'll do it.
Yeah.
When I said I've seen it happen, I was actually referring in the heathen sense. I've seen
children make oaths.
Yeah, you were
we
there,
know,
and we both said something about it. We were like,
we know 2 children who were both under the age of 10 who both took oaths, and they actually their parent made them fulfill the oath even after some really heinous stuff happened, and they agreed not to go to religious events anymore, but they did oath to do work on the property whenever it was required. So even though they weren't religiously tied to events and showing up for Sunday
they were still
worship,
held to that oath, and their parents made them do it.
the parents still made the child show up and do the work, even though they weren't tied to the group anymore.
Wow.
That was something that both me and Belfeld as well were enraged about.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's something it was one of the inspirations for us leaving a particular group, and this wasn't Theod. This is a group that was not Theodish, but started implementing a lot of these practices towards the end of our time there, and we were just like, no, you can't fucking do that. Yeah. And it culminated in an issue where an accusation of sexual harassment was not taken seriously. That's when we left. That's when a bunch of other people left, all in one giant group. A bunch of us met together and voted, and discussed, shared our experiences, and voted. And
honestly, had we not left, that group they were like 1 or 2 steps away from full blown religious cult with a guy who wanted us to be king. He wanted to be king, wanted us to be his subjects. He was setting up a network across the United States. Other people.
Tell him about the "I'm destined to be king" stories at the Vey.
So here's an interesting story, and this happened to multiple people. We found out later. We all thought that we were the only one, but the guy would walk out in the woods and go, "Hey, come walk out to the Vey," which is our religious
space,
our
sacred circle in the woods.
Out in the woods, it's an amazing place, and so to be invited out there by the religious leader, when you're considered, lower or newer, not as much knowledge, it felt like a high honor. So you go out there and we talked for like 3 or 4 hours. He tells you this grand vision, this I see heathenry being this mainstream thing, and it's going to be beautiful, and I have this great plan, and I've got a message from the gods, and all this stuff. I ended up being this king, and I've built this network, and I've got these, followers all over the country, and I want you at my side. And it makes you feel, when you're this searching person, and it's also new, it makes you feel very important. Come to find out, he gave the same thing to 15 other dudes, and we all bought it hook, line, and sinker. And
he says that to all the heathens.
Yeah, and he did.
That's what it was.
It's what
he
did.
didn't to me, oddly enough.
Yeah.
He didn't to me either.
And I think that I have suspicions as to why.
Yep.
That actually hits another point on the bite model about shower you with praise and attention, also called
love bombing.
Yep. Yeah,
and that's what it was.
Theodism does that.
I would get personal messages and stuff like that. I would, they would put a bug in my ear, or lean on me in their times of trouble. But turns out they were doing it to everybody else too, just to make us feel special.
Yeah,
right.
That is a big one for how leaders control people, and we literally have only hit on 2 points on the bite model, you guys.
Let's keep going.
Modify behavior with rewards and punishments. Now, obviously, you talked before about how basically there was kind of a class system, essentially. So I'm assuming that you rise the ranks as you perform.
In Theodism, yes. As you were worthing, you would rise up.
Yeah. They have this concept of thews, THEWS. And that's like the social mores of the group, and so when one prescribes to the group and follows the thews, then it's part of it as well. So you're having a behavioral control through these mores that you're trying to follow.
Okay, let's see. Dictate where and with whom you live. Does that apply at all to Theodism?
Have they required anybody to move or something like that?
They've required people to travel.
Oh yeah, that's right. There was a thing, you have to be summoned. If you're summoned, you have to be there, and if you can't afford the trip, then someone's going to front the money for you in order to do it.
The group that Beofold is referencing is actually about an hour away from us. Beofold actually and we live within about 5 minutes of each other. We live damn near next door. And so if you were required to get up in the middle of the night and travel an hour and you didn't have the money, it was kind of on you a little bit. Like, you could go through this process to maybe get reimbursed, but yeah, it was very like up on you.
That is exploit you financially, also on the behavior control.
Oh, there it is.
Hey,
there you go.
Look at that.
Restrict or control sexuality. I can't imagine there being a whole lot of that with a pagan group.
Actually, there's a story related directly to this group we're talking about.
Oh yeah, there's a thing, isn't there?
Beofold, do you want to go into that a little bit?
So restrict or control sexuality. There was a one of the lords in Theodism had his Facebook conversation screenshotted, and in the conversation, it was essentially asking about transition. So a person who perhaps goes through a gender transition while they're inside of the group. And the brunt of it is that the group would not recognize their transition because they would be whatever they were at birth. And they would have to obey the rules associated with the birth gender, because the individual is supposed to subsume themselves to the tribe. And the tribe would be the way that they would have to go with it. And so if you were trans, it would be really difficult. You would be religiously bound to your old gender.
That's as a trans
Or assigned at
person,
birth kind
that's
of thing.
gross.
Right, and it's very weird to hear that because typically pagans are super open to
Right.
the LGBT community.
Right.
Like it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter because especially religiously, there's not supposed to be any doctrine. There's not supposed to be any dogma, and I just use the word dogma. This person who I communicate with used
Was using
the
the
word
word
dogma
as a positive.
as a positive. Yes, we have
That is
dogma.
such a cult
So-
thing to do. To think that a word like that is like, I'm fine with that. I remember
Right.
when I was a witness, I was like, yeah, I'm brainwashed because my brain is scrubbed clean and all the dirt in the big bad world is gone. I embraced that as a concept.
Oh,
And
my
I find
goodness.
that a lot of people who are in really fundamentalist or culty environments, when people say, hey, that's pretty fucked up, they're like, whatever,
Right.
I embrace that. That's, ugh. Yeesh.
There was also the other thing. Actually, Blue Collar Heathen is asking about what it means to not recognize transition within. So basically, there's male roles and female roles within ritual within Theodism, and if you transition, so you would be your assigned at birth gender would be the role that you would fulfill in ritual, regardless of whether or not you've transitioned.
Right.
So what about non-binary people? Are they just still
Most likely
that they're assigned?
Assigned at birth.
Yeah, assigned at birth,
And limited
unrecognized.
to that. You wouldn't be able to flex. So, yeah.
So being gender fluid is just kind of like, nope.
No.
Eh.
Well,
You'd
the
be
individual
whatever you
has to subsume themselves for the tribe.
Right.
That's
Yeah, it's whatever the tribe says.
And
That's-
then as far as sexuality, there was that other thing that was in that PFL that you're regarding
Talking about the sexual
talking about-
offender.
the shell game with the sexual offender. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there was apparently in a different theod a sexual offender that they were. So once you're in, you're in. You know, their luck is tied to you once you're in, and so they're all in when you're in. And as it turns out, one of their members in one of the theods was a sexual offender of some sort, according to some stuff that got in an expose at one point. But they just completely covered for the person, 100%.
Unfortunately, in heathen cult-like practices, heathen groups where leaders tend to elevate themselves, the group that we were 3 in is not a Theodist group. We haven't been in one, but we had a situation like that come up where the religious leader was trying to cover for sexual misconduct and basically try to sweep it under the rug. And this did happen and was documented in the Theod group.
And this happened in our group too, so it's
Right. And that's when we left.
yeah.
Yeah, we left because of that, and many.
That was the tipping point. And it
that was the
happened-
tipping point that got us all to communicate. See,
Right.
there
Yeah.
was
A lot of us
limiting
had grumblings
communication.
or individuals, but we didn't
yeah.
go
But
back
then,
and forth
at
with each
that
other.
point, it was big enough that we could all
It
sit
was
down.
everybody's like getting on the phone with people and being like, and some people responded well and some people didn't. Some people were like, they went right along with dude buddy's word and all that jazz.
Yep.
So
We lost a couple friends, and it really sucked.
as a result,
But at the
'cause
same
there was
time-
shunning that resulted from that.
Yeah.
There was a shunning that happened when we left.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so little other elements of the bite model wound up applying into that
Yeah.
group as well. That's non-theod. It's just a heathen
Yep.
group.
We've been there.
Yep.
Ugh. Okay, the next point is control clothing and hairstyle. Obviously, we've already talked about that.
The knots.
plenty. Yeah, that's utterly
That
ridiculous.
is not a thing.
Huh.
Regulate what and how much you eat and drink. Is that
I don't know about that
relevant?
one.
I don't
Um,
know.
Is there a sobriety thing?
No, there's definitely not, because alcohol is part of
Ritual.
ritual, religious ritual. At most, you could say, like, if we really wanted to reach the Havamal, Odin. It's a group of Odin's words that he types out, and I actually go through the Havamal on my Twitter. I call it the daily Havamal, but I usually go about 2 or 3 days between each posting. I try to do it once a day, but I end up tweeting way too much because I'm really funny, and so I don't want to when I want to get into serious mode, I don't want it to be overshadowed by how funny I am, and so there's a big section at the very beginning where it talks about how you're not supposed to drink in excess because it makes you a fool. So that's about as far as that goes. But still, that's not a Bible. Yeah,
and also they're Anglo-Saxon, so the Havamal wouldn't really apply to them.
Right. And the Havamal's not a Bible; it's not dogma. Yeah. You can be a heathen your entire life and have a very fulfilling religious experience with the God and never read or know about the Havamal. It's not required whatsoever. It's just something extra.
But generally speaking, drinking not to excess is good advice.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know how to follow that. I don't know how. I'm just kidding. The only reason that I don't drink to excess now is because I've built up a tolerance.
I heard that.
It is impossible.
Okay. Deprive you of 7 to 9 hours of sleep.
No clue.
Is there any rituals or anything that would keep someone up for a long period of time?
It might be. If it were there, it would be among the details of thraldom that are not public.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
That makes sense. But it could.
But I don't know.
We don't.
There's no way to know.
Yeah. Exploit you financially. We talked about that a little bit before. With basically, if you get called somewhere and you got to pay for the gas, and you just gotta find the money.
Speaking of depriving of sleep, I have heard rhetoric around thraldom and oathing that you are oathed to somebody anytime, day or night. So if you're sleeping and someone calls you and you are being summoned, then your sleep is interrupted. I
think that would apply.
Right. It might, but I think that is something that is at play. I don't know how true that is for Theodism, but I have seen that expressed before in the group that we were talking about previously.
However, in the chat, both Battle Enemy Marie and Blue Collar Heathen say, deprive you of 7 to 9 hours of sleep? Fuck, is my job a cult?
There you go.
Yeah, well...
And they control how you dress. They control...
Well...
God damn. Capitalism's a cult.
It low-key is. But anyway.
Shut up, Bernie, bro.
Okay, restrict leisure time and activities. Would that apply, do you think?
Wait, leisure... Oh,
I haven't heard anything specifically myself. The person that I know is pretty free to do what they want. So it seems like...
he's also a readsman, so...
Yeah.
I want to say real quick, though, touching on what we talked about before, you don't have to hit every point on the bite model for it to be like, oh, that's definitely a cult. Because even though the last couple haven't really applied, there were so many at the beginning that applied that even just if we stopped here, if we didn't even the rest of the bite model, it would definitely be a cult.
It would definitely apply? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's applied already so much that even if the rest don't apply, there's already so much excessive control extended by this group that it's kind of can't not be a cult at this point.
Right.
Let's see. Require you to seek permission for major decisions. That this is a big one. I feel like that applies to a lot of cults.
I mean, you've got a lord.
Say that again.
I would imagine that this would be a big thing when you literally have a feudal system in place.
I suppose if it were something that had a religious bearing, then you probably would. But that's just my thoughts for it just being a cult in the fact that you have this lord that you're beholden to.
Yeah. So the next point on the bite model is under information control. So we're out of behavior. Deliberately withhold and distort information. Now, the fact that they're telling people that knots and ferrous metals are somehow forbidden, I think that alone would qualify it, because you guys have done plenty of research, and that's just not there.
It's not that it's even not there. Not.
Contrary to what is
No.
there.
There are
There's so much not.
traditions that encourage.
Not again.
It's so hard
hate you guys.
not to make puns.
This is why I drink.
Right. But yeah, there's traditions that say the opposite, like
Yeah.
encourage all the things that they forbid, and they're supposed to be under the same religious umbrella. But to deliberately withhold information, clearly as well, like you have to do these things or you don't get the information. If you mess up and you're out of the group, you don't get the information. And we're the only ones that have the information.
According to them.
According to them.
They see themselves as pioneers in the group, that a lot of mainstream heathenry is influenced by them, and
Which is probably
of that nature.
There's two elements to that. One of them is probably that they are what they see as pioneering is probably something that's actually written somewhere else. And then there's also something that they may see as pioneering, which is just a trend that they started that wound up getting sucked up into the greater culture. And from that perspective, I think that's what they mean. But I think that it's likely that what they're talking about is elements that they consider secret knowledge, which is actually just written in a source somewhere else.
Yeah,
is part of what they're pioneering. There's a couple ways to split that. I'd want to hear specifics about what they think they pioneered.
Yeah. Part of what I'm hearing from this is as if you guys are taking the Reconstructionist approach, to them, pioneering is just pulling stuff out of their ass. Like, just doing their own thing.
Some of the things that they consider to be very authoritative are stuff that we would consider to be UPG that they are asserting on people, which is kind of a no-no.
Yeah.
That you can have UPG as a good reason to do stuff for yourself. Right. Having UPG is the reason that other people need to listen to you and agree with you. That's where a line starts to get drawn, where things don't necessarily add up.
Right. And that becomes very monotheistic in nature, as far as like, well, I'm the one guy that saw all this and all this happened and this was my experience. So now all of you have to do everything exactly the same way because I told you. That's not great. Let's see. Forbid you from speaking with ex-members and critics.
I actually can go ahead and check that one off as well, because unless you're in, you don't get the right information. Like, you don't get the full story. Everything's left super vague. Even Beowfield tried to kind of get a little bit more information than was offered, and was kind of stonewalled a little bit.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, Beowfield.
Well, I'm
going to be right back.
I initially wanted to join a different Anglo-Saxon group, and that Anglo-Saxon group pointed me in the direction of the Theodist person, because he was local, and so I didn't know about it. I started talking about it. It seemed all right in the beginning, because they always do. But I ran into some other people who said, you should really look into this a little bit more. They've got this process of oathing, and boy, I looked it up, and there it was. It plain as you could read up on it. And so I tried to probe more for it. Tried to see if I could go for a visit. See what was what, so that I could at least see it from my own eyes. But I didn't get particularly far in trying to take a look at that.
Just didn't let you in.
Nope. But then again, it is what it is, and I didn't really want to be in the whole thraldom thing. It just galls in my throat.
Yeah. That's just a huge red flag right off the bat.
Oh, absolutely.
So the next point is discourage access to non-cult sources of information. So I know that they have definitely made themselves up to be the only source of the true info, but do they actively discourage getting your sources from anywhere else?
I can't speak to that.
The Lord is the ultimate arbiter of the knowledge. I don't know whether they dig, but if he says it isn't, then it isn't. and so he would be able to negate anything that you did bring from the outside that wasn't what he would think would be.
That also feeds into the next point, which is divides information into insider versus outsider doctrine. So basically, if the Lord says, "Nah, that ain't it," then it ain't it.
There's a definite inside and outside, because the entire concept of worthing is built on the understanding that if you're not in, you are without worth. You're worthless, and so you have to build your worth from being from the inside. And so the only people with worth are the people who are in the Theod, and everyone else, all of us, we are worthless to them, completely and utterly.
Amazing. That feeds into emotion control, promote feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness.
That's in stars, isn't it? Like,
Ooh.
like it doesn't need to be explained, but we'll go ahead and say it just to tap it on the nose that if you're being described as worthless upon entry,
Yeah.
it's implied.
Yeah.
That's okay. Generate and use propaganda extensively. This I haven't heard much about from what you guys have said so far.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Like you don't have
publish a lot
Theos
of
coming
books.
up to your door and giving you like brochures or anything like that.
Well, we got to
But
remember
books,
that we
yeah.
are our deeds is a book that's published.
It's a Theodish book.
It's the
by the White
Theodish
Mush.
book.
Mhm.
You did tell me about that.
And
Yeah.
so the fact is that gained quite a following in heathenry in general, and I could go line by line in that book historically and break it down and tell exactly where it is propaganda. And the propaganda is it's trying to lay a slant towards the tribe. And since they're the tribe game in town, then they don't necessarily say Theodism is the answer, but it would be implied because they are the game in town that has the tribe. They are the tribe.
Okay, so generate and use propaganda extensively, maybe not, but they
No.
have produced propaganda.
Yeah.
I would say so. Yes.
Subtly. It's very
Yes.
subtle. And like, honestly, I'll tell a little bit of a story that We Are Our Deeds was something that I'd read, that Beofeld had read, and that some of our friends had read together. And we all thought, it's a good book. It's a good foundational book. And then we decided to do a kind of intro reading heathen book club group kind of thing. We all decided the first one, we were like, We Are Our Deeds. That's the one that we got to read together. And so we did.
Well, we were
And-
using it as a negative example, though.
We wound I
When we-
wound up
when we
discovering
started-
that.
Yeah, when we
Yeah,
started, we
just-
were all recommending it to new heathens.
Yes. And then when we decided to read it together, maybe you already know Beelzebub, but
Yeah.
when all of us started reading it together, for a lot of us, it was a paradigm shift about that book. Because I was starting it with the understanding of, this is a one of a good historical source that it's well researched and all this other kind of stuff. And then we started going into it, and we started going line by line and finding out, that's where he got that idea.
Yeah,
Oh,
like
wait,
Luck
no, that's not
Mortem,
entirely
he killed
founded.
the
Wait, where did
heathen.
he get that?
Well, a
And-
lot of
and
the
then-
ideas in there are based off of Groenbeck, which is he's one of those Nazi era historians that you're
Right.
really not supposed to listen to, and so if they're basing a lot of their concepts on that, then we got problems from the beginning. So
Right.
there are some things in the book, just like there's some half-truths are the most dangerous, because I can read that book and get something out of it. But the thing is that I know where to look and see. I know the difference from shit and shinola. And so the thing is that not everybody is going to have a historical background enough to be able to
Spot those
figure
things.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Which is what makes it propaganda,
Right.
right.
because it's half truth.
They're deliberately just making that distortion.
Yeah, it is distortion on purpose.
A pro tip that I usually give to new people that are looking up sources is to say that this is not entirely true, but it is a good rule of thumb to when you're looking at sources, before 1980 is when you should ask questions. Now, there's exceptions to that. H.R.E. Davidson, for example, was writing in the 40s, and she's very good. But once you hit the 80s, you're pretty much clear of that, or at least mostly clear of that Nazi influence within the scholarship. Although you will find the reason why it's still not a hard rule is that a lot of the people writing in the 80s still use those sources as sources. So there's a web of a mess in trying to find to validate that. But that rule of thumb can generally work. But like I said, there are several exceptions even still.
Okay. That adds up. Okay, so the next one is kind of specific, and I don't know if it will apply to this group, but the next point on the bite model is use information gained in confession sessions against you. So, I mean, how you define confession may be different depending on the group you're in. For example, Scientology, they don't have anything like a confession exactly like in the Catholic sense, but they do have these auditing sessions where you talk about your whole life story, essentially, every single thing you can think of, including the bad things. And they will use that against you, even though it's not in the context of confessing exactly. So I guess, is there anything comparable to that at all?
So from the things that I know, I would say most likely yes, without conclusive proof. But what I can infer from having a lord over you and having to take an oath to that lord, that would be an extremely personal and intimate bond that you would have, even if it's 100% positive. Let's just say this, in this particular instance, this lord is your best friend, and it just so happens that he's your lord now. That would still be one of the most intimate things that two heathens could participate in religiously, because you are bound to them. Your whole, like I said earlier, your entire person, your honor, your identity is bound to this person who is now over you. I can only assume that it would come with, all right, let's have a one-on-one conversation, you and I, and see who you are as a person. Tell me things about you. And if one of those things might be a black mark on your history, now that black mark is owned by someone who is above you, hierarchical in this religious organization.
Right, and that person has absolute power over you.
Exactly.
Okay,
So
so it's not necessarily a part of it, but there's
I can guarantee you
room
it's
for it.
happened. I can guarantee it's happened. I would put my next paycheck on it.
The thing that I would say on this is that I can't guarantee it, but what I do know is that there's a process of through the thraldom, there's a process of getting to know you. That's how it was put.
Yeah, it's required to get to know you.
And then once you are entering into the group, let's see, how is it put? Your luck is tied to all individuals in the group, and so you don't want to mess it up. And so you want to know the person that's going into the group very well, if they're going to be tied to your luck.
Not so well that you'd know if they had a sexual assault on their record, but you know.
I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
And luck in the heathen sense is a little bit different than the like common term of, oh, I've got good luck, or hey, that was really lucky.
It's more like fate in this sense.
Yeah, luck has a really deep meaning for heathens specifically. And when you affect somebody's luck, that's a really big deal. And when you tie your luck to somebody else's luck in the heathen sense, that's also a really big deal. And we had some problems with people trying to tie some really negative things to a group that we were in, and it became a really big deal at that point. So it's something we take very seriously. So when you tie your luck to somebody, you want to make sure that it's somebody that you trust and that isn't bringing in negative things to the group. So when they use that to stonewall people from getting in, it kind of like raises a little bit of red flags when you know that like, hey, I'm not a bad person. I'm not bringing negative things in. Why are you accusing me of or suspecting me of, being this bad luck person?
Okay, that makes sense.
The secretiveness is usually a red flag when it comes to groups,
Yeah.
because a lot of times I think there's reason for heathen groups to not be super open, but because some of the times you get I think that I've heard similar experiences expressed with atheist groups, is that sometimes you'll get people that are Christians that'll come in to try and they're nefarious or some other motivation. So there is a certain warrant to a heathen group being a little secretive, especially in the South. But when you are an out and proud heathen and they're still playing this game of, well, we have to get to know you. We have to play, you need to worth yourself and all this other kind of stuff. That raises red flags, a lot of them.
Okay, so this one is more of an explicit manipulation tactic. Gaslight to make you doubt your own memory.
I don't know about that.
I don't know.
Yeah, that would be a
So with Theodism, I would say I don't know either. I would
experienced it.
If I want to be very honest with myself, I would probably say no. I would say they probably don't do that, and they probably want to work against that.
There's so much emphasis on personal experience within paganism. I would be surprised as well if that was something that.
Yeah,
you see among pagans a kind of a game that's played about denying elements of personal experience, even though it's foundational. For example, I can think of one person that totally dismissed the idea of UPG of having any value whatsoever.
Gosh. And see, that's the dumbest thing. I'm gonna rant. I'm gonna stop.
Within paganism, it's like, oh, okay, you want to just knock the foundations out.
He wanted to throw away an entire section of heathenry because he didn't understand it.
Right. So, anyway, we'll feel strongly about that.
Yeah, no, that's understandable.
So, it's so you do see that, but I don't think Theodism would do that. I think that Theodism would probably embrace it.
Yeah, I would agree.
Especially given the foundation of their with this like vision, the kingly thing. You almost have to embrace it in order to have that be a coherent experience. Right. So
okay, so that one probably not so much. Require you to report thoughts, feelings, and activities to superiors.
I would strongly assume yes. Again, don't have hard evidence based on what I do know. But yeah, if you've got a lord and you've got someone who's trying to feel you out, I would be surprised if there wasn't a loyalty test or two put in place. Ocean and I both dealt with a loyalty test in a group
while texting each other.
And yeah, the guy loyalty tested each other.
Both of us.
He loyalty tested both of us against each other to see which one of us he could trust. Turns out we communicated. We both felt that happening and said, "Hey, do you see this happening?" And he said, "Yeah, I see this happening too." And so we both went back to him and go, "Were you loyalty testing us?" And then he got caught. Like
both of us were messaging him at the same time,
messy.
just like, "Hold the phone! Is this what you just did?"
Both were disloyal.
Right. Then we both got declared disloyal.
Yeah, we both got shamed, but we were both like, "No, you loyalty tested us. We know what you did. Fuck you.
No.
You can't fuck
You played a
Fuck
manipulative game, and that's not cool." And I just sent him the for anybody that finds themselves dealing with religious harm, look up. I think it's Circle of Hope that hands it out. The Wheel of Abuse, I believe it is. Do you know what I'm talking about, Escal Baby?
I have heard of this before. I haven't looked
Yeah.
much into it, but I know what you're talking about.
I'm gonna look it up and then I'll give the actual name.
Yeah, but I know what you're talking about. While you're looking that up, I'm sure that this one will also be involved.
Power and Control Wheel.
Yes.
So this is the power and control wheel. It is sent out by the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence, and it is it is about the cycle of abuse between physical and sexual control, and it has several elements that usually pop up within in emotionally and physically abusive relationships. Definitely something that winds up having a lot of crossover with religious harm as well.
Right. A lot of stuff with cults and a lot of stuff with abusive relationships are basically the same, but just with more people.
Macro scale. Yeah.
Yeah. A cult is essentially a large abusive relationship involving multiple people, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's an abuse of power over another person, an abuse of someone's trust. That's all it really boils down to. The last one on the information control point is encourage you to spy and report on others' misconduct. Now, I would assume that this one is a yes. If we're thinking the one before that one about having to report your own thoughts and feelings, there would be some expectation of snitching on each other as well.
I have no clue.
Yeah, no clue here.
Okay,
that gets into kind of like internal stuff. Like
assume.
none of us are ex-theods, so
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we can only
also
assume, but again, with the evidence given so far,
Right.
it would make sense that would be a thing.
Yeah,
the
but
oathing
there's
thing
no
makes it so that ex-theods are seldom a thing as well. Like, there's but you know, you do have it, and you do see shunning, and you do see like those kind of things going on.
Yeah, you would have to request to leave. You know, if you were going to leave,
Request to be relieved of your oath. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you have to ask to be relieved of the oath, and I was told that upon request you would be, but it's also up to the Lord to relieve you. So if you had a Lord who decided they didn't want to relieve you, they had that opportunity to do so.
Mm.
And the speaking of experience that we have on that is that in the point where we saw like a young kid being oathed to somebody, that it was seen both by the parents of the kid who made the oath and by the person who the oath was made to, that it was the responsibility of the person who the oath was made to relieve them of the oath, and he declined. Which was that was the tossing the snowball down the hill that eventually turned into the schism that it wound up being. But that was something that, again, as I said already previously, that Wolf, Beefeld, and myself were enraged is the word to describe it.
Yeah, that would. I do not like that. I can understand why that would be schism starting. So now we're moving on to the third point of the BITE model, which is thought control. First one under that is instilling black and white, black versus white, us versus them, good versus evil type thinking. Is that?
Well, it's definitely an
100%
inside and outside for them.
Yeah, Utengard and
Utengard.
Altengard.
There's also worthed and worthless.
Yeah, that would definitely fit that point. Absolutely. Change your identity, possibly even your name.
Heathen names are common.
Yeah, heathens usually tend to do this anyways. Like Wolf the
so
Red
it's not anything
is
that's exclusive to Theodism.
I was not born under the name Ocean.
Yeah, I kind of figured Wolf the Red was a chosen name. I kind of figured you guys all picked your names. I mean,
I sprung from the earth.
Theophald
So.
was born with those runes tattooed on his chest.
Yeah, I sprung from the earth. I'm telling you.
And Ocean was a name that was given to me, but
he waded out of
but
the
not
sea.
Right. No, I've Triton threw me out of the ocean, and I'm here to anyway. So yeah,
Wolf the Red was suckled by wolves.
I was raised by wolves.
Romulus and Remus ain't got nothing on him.
It took me a really long time to learn how to stop peeing on things.
you know, if you guys.
Oh, you finally mastered that?
Yeah, by really long time, I mean like last week.
Like I said, not the last time you came to my house.
I will end the live stream. I'm just kidding. This is hilarious. I truly enjoyed it.
I'm just letting you all know that it's safe to invite me over.
Okay, that's good.
How are you going to teach your kid? Are you going to teach him to lift his leg? You know?
Oh, he's already marking things. It's great.
Okay.
He's peed on my beard. What do you expect? He's a
Your beard is no longer your own.
It's true. He owns part of it. Well, hell, he was born with a beard. I'm proud of him.
Okay.
There are baby pictures of him with a beard.
That's adorable. Use loaded language and cliches to stop complex thought. So this one is a little bit like requires explanation to some degree. I would say the most obvious example of this is maybe you have a Christian who has some questions about why something is a certain way, why the church leaders are doing this and that, and somebody just tells them, well, I guess in my case specifically, I would be told to leave it in Jehovah's hands. And then I would not think on that any further. That was the end of the thought process.
That tends to not be a heathen thing, even with theodes.
So,
we're very action oriented.
Yeah.
And I'd say theodes even more so. So, while there might be some cliches using kind of terminology that's thrown around in paganism and heathenry specifically, that may be used in a way that is manipulative, it's possible. But I don't think that kind of the kind of response that you're talking about.
Yeah, binary.
That the kind of response that you're talking about just isn't something that's indicative of heathenry. It just doesn't show up in our faith.
Yeah,
I would translate that to theodism, because theodism's, like, with all the disagreements that we have with it, it's still heathenry, and so those tenets still definitely exist within it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so, I don't know how much this one will apply. Induce hypnotic or trance states to indoctrinate. So not just general use of this, but specifically to use it to make something more believable.
That's something that I would.
I have no clue.
Yeah,
No clue. I would.
Not 100%.
They wanted to interview an insider on that, but they're not going to tell us. So.
If that's a thing, it's very much an insider thing.
I can say that I would say that to exotic trance states. I don't know. The let me take you out to the Vey and tell you how I'm a king. That experience kind of like straddles the line on that, but it's not trance stating. It's not hypnotic. It's just manipulation.
Yeah. Okay. Teach thought-stopping techniques to prevent critical thoughts.
No clue.
I wouldn't assume that. That's another thing.
I think that with paganism, just a lot of these thought control section ones are not going.
They're hard.
Apply.
They're very hard, because especially with heathenry is so like aggressively individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
And even with, so I'd say that like one of the big descriptions of heathenry would be to say that like you should be the best individual that you can be, so that you can be you can help your community, right, in the best way possible. Mm-hmm. That's the way that you contribute. Now, as a result, these kind of things of like trying to stop people from thinking or wind up like going along with the group and that kind of thing. That kind of individuality quashing isn't a theme within heathenry. Whether or not it is with theodism specifically, it's possible, but I wouldn't be aware of the mechanism.
I would almost guarantee that it's not based on the theodes that I do know and interact with.
Beyond the loyalty element.
Yeah. So with thought control specifically, the way that they are successful, it's not on the list, and I understand that if it's not on the list, then it's not, the criteria or whatever that would fall under that. But the way that I would say
that
it's
made by some guy. It's not hard and fast.
Okay, I got you. Okay, so the way that they would fall under thought control, just in general, is that they tell you, they hold the information right out of reach, and they tell you, this is the way that you have to be to join us. This is the way that you have to act and whatnot. This is the way you have to dress and look and all that stuff.
So the thought control is kind of done through the control of behavior and information.
Exactly. It gets you to the point where you want to be part of the tribe. That's where the thought control key is if you want to be inside with us, this is the way you got to be. You may even think differently, but you better not show it, because as soon as you start showing that you're not one of the tribe, you're out of the tribe, and then all of your information is gone.
Well, that interestingly leads into emotional control. Because I'm just going to skip the rest of thought control because I think that from what we've discussed,
I looked
Let me-
at
let me
the
look
rest
through
of the
them.
list, and I would say no to
Yeah,
all
I'd
of
say
those.
no.
the first one on emotional control is instill irrational fears or phobias of questioning or leaving the group.
I would say
100%.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, I thought that might be. Blue collar heathen wants to know how precisely is the lord of the group determined?
Appointed.
So there can be multiple lords. There's going to be someone above all the lords.
Until you get to this king guy who's self-appointed.
Yeah, and then you're gonna have, you're gonna have multiple group leaders. So there are multiple organizations of Theodism across the country. I think there's about 4 of them total. I have a list, but I'm not going to name them just for safety reasons. But the one in our area has a top leader, and then he's got a couple guys, and then they've got a couple guys, and it just kind of
It's a pyramid.
pyramid schemes down that way.
Mhm.
And
Not
so
in an MLM sort of way, but it is a pyramid.
for sure. But whoever it is you make your oath to, that's your personal lord. And so that's how that would be determined. And it would probably
It's kind
be
of an MLM, then, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's like,
there
sounds
could be-
kind of like you're recruiting people into the group with these oaths.
Yeah.
Interesting.
absolutely.
Okay. The next point on emotional control is label some emotions as evil, worldly, sinful, or wrong.
I would
Well-
say in heathenry we don't have the sinful thing,
Yeah,
but then
I-
Wolf
But he
kind of blew that
literally
out of the
used
water.
word sin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I initially saw that and was like, that's probably not going to apply, but you used your
You used
friend
sin.
used the word sin, which is like,
Yeah.
okay,
I was surprised.
sin.
I forgot
That blew
that he
my
said
that blew my mind.
Yeah, I forgot that he had used the word sin, because I've moved away from the word sin so much that I don't even think about it unless it's talking about Christianity.
Yeah. It's,
But
it's
after
a
I went back and
real
read that, I was like,
Christian word.
holy shit, he used the word sin. That's so weird.
Right.
That is
But when you specifically say emotions, maybe not. Emotions is very specific. It's really hard to control or tell people to control emotions in heathenry.
Yeah.
Because we are a very passionate group of individuals anyways.
And it's kind of embraced.
Yeah, it's emotions are pretty heavily embraced. And to their credit, the Theods that I do know, they're very like anti-toxic masculinity. They're very, I watched this movie and I cried. Stuff like that. So they do embrace
very
their
open with
emotions,
emotions.
and they
Okay.
try to
It's like
talk about it.
having emotions in a masculine sense is fine as a heathen.
Yeah.
It's something that I think differentiates it from the common form of Christianity masculinity that we see, where you
It's
have
funny
to be
because
like,
I've heard so many different versions of that. I've heard people go like, "Oh, Jesus was the ultimate man, but he was like tender and loving, so you got to be nice."
Right.
But then there's the other people that are just like, Samson killed a lion.
If you
with
cry,
bare
you're a
hands."
pussy. You ain't no
Yeah.
real man.
Yeah,
I'm going to make the Crusades look like a joke.
yeah. But either way, there's such a weird.
And we get that with some heathens. We call
Yeah.
them brohalas. They think that they're
Brosatru.
too, brosatru. They think they're too manly to show emotions, and they just have to be meat-headed brutes all the time because that's what Odin would want, and all this bullshit. And so,
Not knowing that,
I mean,
like,
I've only read like this much of the Havamal, but I don't think that's true.
so
it's absolutely not true.
if you look at one of the things I mentioned in my most recent video that we're talking about.
Everyone should watch.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But in there, I was talking about how there's some forms of paganism that will divide the gods into two deities, a masculine and a feminine. And I mentioned Odin as one of the ones that is complicated in regards to this, where you can't necessarily fit Odin entirely into a masculine or feminine identity. The reason why is when you look into the lore, there are several tells that you would make it so that you would assign Odin as queer, essentially. So there's his practice with Sether. There's there's Sether is regarded as a woman's practice, essentially, a woman's practice of magic. But one of the primary deities of it is Odin. and that's one of many little things that make you go, okay,
Yeah.
not entirely.
This
You
isn't
know,
an
so-
entirely masculine thing.
Right. And there's several deities that are like that. So it's interesting, really, that a lot of these like overly masculine heathens will sometimes try to use Odin as sort of an avatar for that image of what we refer to as Brosatru. Because it matches up with an idea of Odin that exists in popular culture, but doesn't exist when you look at the historical references that are made about him.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So, motion's wrong? Nah, not really. We already talked about promote feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness. That's a big...
That's literally in the description.
Yep.
shower you with praise and attention. Love bombing. That's also...
That's also a
Yep.
thing.
thing.
Yep.
Threaten your friends and family. I don't think so.
Not
That
that I'm aware of.
That one I
Not that I'm aware of from
only
Theodism.
applies to like the most extreme cults.
I have experienced threats within heathenry, though.
I was about to say, the reason I'm not naming names is to avoid that from maybe happening.
Yep.
Honestly.
So it's possible.
If I'm being very honest, the reason I'm not naming any names, I'm not even naming organization names, because it could get back to somebody and it could be a thing.
Yep.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Obviously, we've talked about this one. Shun you if you disobey or disbelieve.
Yes, you would be out of the group.
If you,
Teach that
and you
there
lose
is
your friend
no-
circle and all that kind of stuff. What we've
And
talked
you
about
lose
with-
your worth.
right,
Ah,
and what we've talked
yeah.
about with Jehovah's Witnesses before, they do the very similar things.
Mhm.
Like that not only the shunning, but that if you're interacting with the outside, we talked about how there was one that showed up in my server at one point that started saying like, "Hey, I'm an access point for understanding it," and all that other kind of stuff, and that you were talking about how familiar that behavior was to you, right?
Yeah, kind of just showing up and being like, anybody can ask me about what my beliefs. I'm always ready to talk about my beliefs.
Right.
Urgh.
So, and you get theos that will do that, and it's a recruitment strategy.
Mhm.
As Jehovah's Witnesses doing the same thing, it's a recruitment strategy. The targets are different, though. Usually, they'll try to go for
Other
heathen communities,
yeah.
Whereas Jehovah's Witnesses seem to just go for anybody and everybody that has a door.
You have
Not even the doors. Not even the doors. Listen, there are so many different forms of witnessing that I have done in my life. I have made phone calls from like just a list of phone numbers. I have
Really? You did cold calls?
Uh-huh. I hated it. I didn't do it
Oh
often.
my
I avoided
God.
it whenever possible. Okay?
You mean to
But
tell me
I
they can
did
come
it.
through my telephone too?
And in fact, because they are quarantined right now, that's their primary method.
Oh, they're
of reaching
calling people.
currently. Yes, they are smart enough, believe it or not. Their leadership is
No.
smart enough to tell them for the most part. I've heard of some witnesses still knocking on doors, but I think they might be a little bit rogue because as far as I talked to my mom about it recently, and she told me that they are all writing letters and making phone calls. They are not door-to-door preaching right now.
Hmm.
Yeah. So basically, virtual.
So even they're better than these people that are trying to drive into church parking lots.
Yes, they're holding all of their meetings on Zoom right now.
Yep. Got
They're
it.
not. No.
Wow.
And I
The
respect
Jehovah's
hell out of
Witnesses
them
know
for that.
better.
But here's
than
the thing: Jehovah's Witnesses have a very God's gonna help you if you help yourself mentality. They don't believe in God just sweeping in and saving them from their own stupidity most of the time. It depends on the situation.
Right.
There are definitely some situations where they're just like, they're either like, God will save me, or like, oh, well, if I die, then God will resurrect me, essentially. But for the most part, they tend to be on the side of, I don't want to make God save. God's not going to save me from my own stupidity if I don't just take basic precautions in my life. So, fortunately, they are on the side of stay at home. Fortunately.
Right. That's
So I
good.
don't have to worry about my family quite as much.
That's a plus.
Yeah. I mean, they're not talking to me, but at least I don't have to worry
Right.
about one of them
But at least
turning
you don't have to
dead.
worry about them.
And the last point on the bite model is teach that there is no happiness or peace outside of the group.
I wouldn't say that about
Yeah,
them.
I that doesn't feel pagan at all. Like as a concept, like you can
No.
only do it our way.
I think even with the Theodism, which I'd say is a more extreme form of heathenry, you still have that element of pluralism where, and maybe they don't, but I would suspect that they do. The element of pluralism and recognizing other people's deities and other people's traditions. It seems
The
to
only
be a
way
thing
that I
that's
would say
common.
that would apply is if your happiness is dependent on, having a group to practice with.
Yes.
Then yeah, you would lose that.
Yeah.
And so good luck finding another group who
It's not
practices like we do.
right, or as consistently, because theods, they definitely do regular events and that kind of thing, and that's something that
Right.
a lot of heathens that are independent practitioners yearn for. Like they're looking for communities that are able, like when I have polytheists reach out to me in DMs, oftentimes they'll mention that they're looking for a local group or they're trying to find one and have been failing. And what is my advice for finding one and that kind of thing. And it is very complicated and very tedious because, like, first, again, we're not a super public for the reasons that we mentioned before, but there's also in that kind of like cautiousness, there winds up being a good cloud cover for things like folkism, neo-Nazis, and abusive cult practices like what we're talking about.
Right. And it's just kind of like, for example, I was watching it was a while back. There was a Netflix documentary, because I'm a person that watches documentaries for fun. But there was a Netflix documentary about this guy that started this like hot yoga craze, and they never called, like, the word cult was never said throughout the documentary, but it was like, this guy is a cult leader.
That's wild.
This guy's a cult leader. He is rich and charismatic, and all of the people that learn from him want to be just like him, and they will let him sexually assault them if that means that they can stay in the group. It's just like, cults can come from anywhere, even the most unlikely sources. And I mean, paganism on its face, by so many of its sort of tenets, if you could even call them that, is so individualistic that it's, well, yeah. But I guess
I'd say if you wanted to speak specifically
at
and
least
kind of say what you
heathenry.
mean, you could say heathenry. Yeah.
Yeah, at least with heathenry, it's so individualistic and based on personal experience. It seems like you wouldn't be able to make a cult out of that. It seems like anything in that area would be safe, but that's
And yet you
not
can.
necessarily the case. No.
Right.
It's good to.
Yeah, it
to
sucks
look
that
out
you
for
can
these
make
kinds of things.
cults out of religion and hot yoga.
Yeah, not even hot yoga is safe. I mean,
Right.
No, I mean, really, and that's, since I deconverted and I started researching these kinds of things, I realized, like, you can literally make anything a cult.
Just
as
ask
long
Drew
as
about
you
essential
have,
oils.
Yeah. I know that one because I've had so many people in my family that have gotten my mom sold for so many different MLMs in my lifetime. She never made any money off of them, so I don't know why she kept doing that. Like that was going to be like, oh, the next one will make me money.
No,
But,
the
like,
next one's it.
Yeah.
It's like a gamble. It's like buying a lottery ticket.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh well, that one didn't work, but
Oh yeah,
this one
Jen
might.
Aldrich in the chat mentioned
The tiger
we've
cult.
all been made aware
Been
of
made
some
of it.
tiger cults recently. Yeah, Tiger.
I still
King
haven't seen
even.
that.
yeah,
I still
I
haven't
haven't
seen
either. I
I
refuse.
won't watch it. I've seen enough memes. I know the entire plot
Yeah,
line.
you
It's
get,
just
you get
a
the
meme.
gist. You get the gist.
Bethel just learned what the internet is, so
Right.
But really, like, there are even cults in that. Like, there's a dude who is one of the guys who has a private zoo with, big exotic cats and stuff, and he has like
a whole cult.
he has like 7 wives or some shit like that, and they all like come to work at his zoo as like teenagers or in their early 20s, and they end up just kind of staying there their whole life. They work at like they hardly get paid. They work night and day. They live on the zoo property. It's like, you can literally make a cult out of anything. You could make a cult out of working at a zoo if the person in charge is charismatic enough.
I
Well, it's
heard
interesting
he
'cause-
baptizes you with his penis.
What?
I mean,
Yeah.
What? Okay. All right.
There's
So-
one instance I wanted to address real quick before we move away from that, was that one lady had her arm torn off, or I'm sorry, damaged
Oh,
severely.
you're talking about Tiger King, right?
Yes,
That was actually a trans guy, and he got misgendered for the entirety of the documentary.
There you go. Learn
Holy
something new
shit,
every day.
okay.
So he was attacked and harmed, and was sent to the hospital. And they said, "Hey, if you'll just let us repair your arm, it'll take you a while, but we can fix this, and you'll have almost no side effects, and your arm will be fine." And he said, "No, chop it off. I need to get back to work." And went back to work the next, like within 3 days,
Right.
was back to work with the Tigers because he didn't want to miss any work because
And
that's
he
how
didn't want
dedicated
to
he was.
make you look bad.
Right. He didn't want to make the zoo look bad, so he'd rather just get rid of the arm and get back to work and like, hey, see, I'm fine. Yeah, I lost my arm, but I'm fine. It's okay. I chose that.
Yeah.
Instead of
Fuck.
going months with physical therapy and being out of work.
Yeah, which is just insane. And it's really just a hijacking of the human brain, which, as someone who had their brain hijacked, it's not great. I don't
Right.
love it.
I would agree.
wish that these kinds of things would go away, but I think that it's, above all, it is important not only to know that certain religions can do harm, but how they do it so that
Right.
somebody can be on guard for it.
Right.
Mhm.
Because a lot of it isn't just, I mean, there's stuff like covering up of child abuse and things like that are like physical, obvious harm. But then there's psychological harm that you have to know you're being harmed
Right.
in order to even catch it.
And I think that part of the reason why is like we just mentioned how it can pop up in a tiger zoo, that it's not necessarily the fact that it's religion that makes it capable of this.
Right.
Because you find
No, that's
this
not
you find this
inherent
kind of
religion.
thing showing up in politics, you find it showing up in stores, you find it showing up in just like management levels, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You find it because when I got my start working in film, right? The one of the things that I found was that you wind up sometimes early in your career, you'll wind up in places where you are working for a very demanding and emotionally abusive producer that is monopolizing your time. I did a series of days in a month where I worked a 20-hour day, a 23-hour day, and then a 19-hour day, all back to back for an independent feature. And
Holy
I
shit.
was, young in my career, and I didn't realize what the lack of sleep and how unsafe all of it was. And this was over the course of 3 24-hour periods. It wasn't like there was 8 hours in between these working periods. This was 3 24-hour periods that I worked that. And it was ridiculous, but it was one of the things that started off my career or whatever the hell. But it was a thing that I think that it bears a similarity of the thought control elements, because this stuff pops up in places that aren't religion, and it makes it sometimes we're willing to call it out in religion, we're not willing to call it out where it shows up elsewhere because it's not religion. But I think that something you
Jen
should point
Aldrich
out
made a good point that said we've seen it happen with some atheist leaders as well, with the cult of personality and them blatantly abusing it. But then, like you just said, that's excused, dismissed, or ignored completely.
right,
Yeah.
because it's not religion. And then
People think of cult-like behavior as being
you got to think of the
specifically
movement.
religious thing, but it's
Right.
not. It is just an abusive relationship extended to multiple people, really.
And that can show up in multiple places that aren't religion, and it can show up in religions that have a reputation of not being harmful.
Yeah.
So nowhere is really immune to these kind of things. You shouldn't be disarmed from looking for those kind of signs when you're looking at a religion that you may have an understanding of being a religion that stands against religious harm, because you might be familiar with stuff that I put out or stuff that Wolf puts out, where we have rhetoric that kind of points out those things. It still shows up. It's still there, and you need to be aware of it. And I'm telling you absolutely that I've experienced it in groups as a heathen, with heathen groups, with heathens leading it, and it's not immune. Nothing is.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts from you, Bayfeld?
I would just say that that in most of these cases, nobody sets out to join a cult.
True.
They're not setting out to go and join this. It's something that happens like a lobster in a pot. You're acclimated to it until the point in which you're cooked. And at that point, when you're in it, it's very hard to get out of it. And it takes a lot of wherewithal to be able to break out of it. And a lot of the people that would be in something like this would completely disagree with every point that was made.
Yeah.
And, there's not really anything that could be said to dissuade them, because no matter the logic that you put into it, logic doesn't count in these cases. And these are things that can happen when you least expect it. The three of us were in a group that was going this direction. Many of the things, we lived some of these things.
Yeah, within 6 months, it would have been something that we might not have even been able to stop. But
Right.
luckily, we were able to gather a large group of people, and we took almost the entire mass, woke pretty much everybody up, and got the hell out.
Right.
Because it was going down a path towards that. But not everyone would do that. Not everyone can do that.
Right.
Not everyone would see that.
Not everyone joins the group when they're at this transition period either.
No.
Yeah.
And
So we
so-
had the opportunity to see it coming.
Right.
And, that's not an opportunity that everybody gets when they join one of these things. Sometimes they're joining a group that is already established in these practices, knows how they work and knows how to exact them and knows how to sucker you in and keep you there. That situation was a little different for us.
We were able to achieve that because of honest and open communication, and it actually took Bayfeld. He was probably the main key in helping everybody, because everybody kind of had their suspicions a little bit, but Bayfeld was very good at quietly going around and saying, "Hey, without raising alarms, ask the right kind of questions that got everybody thinking." And then we decided to hold a meeting separately, and we were able to lay all the cards on the table, and that's when it painted. I often refer to it as a puzzle. We each had a puzzle piece a very disturbing puzzle at the end of it all.
It didn't paint a pretty picture.
Exactly.
Wolf, do you have any other closing comments or thoughts?
Just basically, I would encourage people to, think critically, use your beautiful brain, and make sure that you feel safe in everything that you do, even if it is just hot yoga or
Visiting a zoo.
Yeah, if you're visiting the zoo and the zoo owner wants to give you drugs, maybe don't do that. Yeah, so just be careful out there, because there's unfortunately danger around every corner. But open communication, it's probably one of my biggest personal tenets is communicate as much as you can, as respectfully as you can, and we can all build a much better world together that way.
Beautiful. Ocean, do you have any final thoughts?
I think I gave them a while ago.
Yeah, you kind of did, but I just wanted to make sure. You
no,
talk
I'm
a
good.
lot, so I figured by now you'd have come up with something else.
Yeah, I won't shut up. You can just smack me.
Okay, well, thank you
It's part
guys.
of the problem with having me in a cult. I don't shut up.
Yeah, that's true. But that's how we ended up having that 3-hour conversation, which led to this almost 3-hour conversation.
Right. Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for coming on and discussing this. I appreciate the amount of time and research that you have put into this to be prepared for this discussion. I very much appreciate your time and effort and energy and the use of your beautiful brains in this endeavor. I think that we entertained some people, and I think that we informed some people. So, 2 check marks off my list. I'm happy with that.
And thank you. And thank you definitely for having us on. Because I know when we had this conversation, we said this is pretty much the perfect topic for the two of us to do a collab on. And I'm glad that we did. And thank you for hosting it.
No problem. I'm privileged to have all 3 of you on my channel. I hope that we can collaborate more in the future. If you need to interview an atheist for anything, hit me up, I guess.
Definitely will.
All right. I'm going to end this stream. Thank you, everybody in the live chat, for coming and chatting with us. I am Xcult Baby, reminding you to go free yourself.